Long before the first halo ring ever ignited across the cosmos, long before the Covenant waged their holy war, and even before the mighty Forerunners claimed dominion over the stars, there existed beings so ancient and powerful that they walked among dimensions as easily as we walk between rooms. These were the Precursors, and their story is where everything in the Halo universe truly begins. They were architects of reality itself, shapers of galaxies, and the unwitting authors of the greatest tragedy the Milky Way would ever witness. But how did these godlike beings come to exist? What drove them to seed entire galaxies with life? And what catastrophic betrayal transformed them from benevolent creators into the universe's most terrifying nightmare? Well, in today's video, we're diving deep into the origins of the Precursors and uncovering the cosmic horror that shaped the Halo universe as we know it. The Precursors stand as the most ancient beings ever to exist in the Halo canon, so old that their origins might actually predate the current universe itself. Think about that for a moment. These beings potentially existed before the Big Bang, before time and space as we understand them even began. The Forerunners, who would later classify every civilization they encountered on a technological tier system, placed the Precursors at Tier 0, which they called Transcension. This wasn't just the highest classification, it was a theoretical ceiling that the Forerunners themselves, for all their incredible advancement, could never hope to reach. The Precursors weren't bound by the normal laws of physics, they weren't limited to single physical forms, and they possessed abilities that seemed more like magic than science to everyone who came after them. What truly set the Precursors apart was their mastery of something the Forerunners could only barely comprehend, a metatechnological science they called neural physics. This wasn't just advanced technology, it was a fundamental understanding that the entire universe itself was alive. Not alive in the way we think of organic life, but conscious and aware on a scale so vast and alien that even grasping the concept was beyond most species. Neural physics allowed the Precursors to manipulate the very fabric of reality, to draw power from the living cosmos itself and reshape existence according to their will. They could travel between galaxies instantaneously, accelerate the evolution of entire species across millions of years in mere moments, and construct structures that would endure for billions of years without a single sign of decay. Using neural physics, the Precursors built wonders that would leave even the Forerunners in absolute awe millions of years later. They created what came to be known as star roads, massive constructs of unbending filaments that physically linked planets and entire star systems together, forming bridges through space that defied conventional understanding. These weren't simple structures. They were living architecture woven from the neural fabric of the universe itself, capable of self-adjustment and adaptation across astronomical timescales. The Precursors also constructed artificial planets and manipulated the orbits of stars themselves, casually reshaping solar systems to suit their grand designs. And perhaps most incredibly, they created the domain, a transcendent repository of knowledge containing over 100 billion years of accumulated wisdom and experience. The domain was far more than just a database or library. It was a conscious, living entity, a metaphysical space woven from neural physics that stored not just information but the actual lived experiences of countless beings across incomprehensible spans of time. Every thought, every discovery, every moment of joy or suffering from billions of years of existence was preserved within its quantum architecture. The domain projected a massive field throughout the Milky Way galaxy, allowing access to this cosmic knowledge from anywhere, regardless of distance or location. The Forerunners would later discover and appropriate the domain for their own use, never fully understanding that they were merely borrowing something created by beings infinitely more advanced than themselves. They had no idea of its true nature or origin, and they certainly never imagined the terrible price they would one day pay for their ignorance. But for all their godlike powers and reality-bending technology, the Precursors weren't cold or distant cosmic entities. They were driven by a profound philosophy centered around the concept they called the Mantle of Responsibility. The Precursors believed that the universe itself was enriched by the experiences of living beings, that consciousness and life added something essential to the greater cosmic whole. Every struggle, every triumph, every moment of existence contributed to what they called the sweetness, an emotional or experiential state that had no equivalent in human understanding. The Precursors saw themselves as gardeners of the universe, carefully seeding galaxies with diverse forms of life, then stepping back to watch those species grow, evolve, struggle, and ultimately contribute their unique experiences to the living tapestry of existence. The precursors were not strictly benevolent in the way we might understand morality. They believed that strife, pain, and even evil were inherent and necessary parts of the universe. The struggles between good and evil, the pleasures and pains of existence, all of these added depth and richness to the universal experience. The precursors themselves existed in many different forms across their billions of years of existence. Sometimes they were hyper-advanced and spacefaring, traveling between galaxies and seeding new worlds. Other times they chose to live primitively, remaining confined to single planets and experiencing existence from an entirely different perspective. They evolved countless times, died away, were reborn, and explored the infinite possibilities of consciousness across dimensions and realities that we can barely imagine. Around 15 million years ago, the precursors created one of their most ambitious species yet. On the world of Gibelb, they crafted a race of beings they intended to serve as their assistants and adjutants, a species of incredible potential that would one day grow to dominate the galaxy. These were the Forerunners, and for millions of years, everything seemed to proceed according to the Precursors' grand design. The Forerunners evolved, advanced, and spread across the stars, developing technology that would make them the most powerful civilization in the galaxy, second only to their creators. The Precursors watched with satisfaction as their newest creation flourished, and when the time came, they bestowed upon the Forerunners the Mantle of Responsibility, charging them with the sacred duty of protecting and nurturing all other life in the galaxy. But the Precursors understood something the Forerunners did not. The mantle wasn't meant to be held forever by any single species. It was a temporary stewardship, meant to be passed on when the time was right. Around 10 million years before the main events of the Halo games, the Precursors made a decision that would seal the fate of the entire galaxy. They had been observing another of their creations, a diverse collection of species that had evolved on a world called Erde-Tyrene, beings who would collectively come to be known as humanity. The Precursors saw in ancient humanity something special, a potential for compassion, adaptability, and wisdom that surpassed even the Forerunners. After careful deliberation, they decided that humanity, not the Forerunners, would be the true inheritors of the Mantle of Responsibility. When a Forerunner expedition to the satellite galaxy of Pathkathona encountered their creators and discovered this plan, the reaction was catastrophic. The Forerunners, who had grown arrogant and prideful in their power, could not accept being cast aside. They believed themselves to be the pinnacle of creation, the rightful rulers of the galaxy for all time. The idea that they were merely temporary stewards, that they would be replaced by what they saw as a lesser species, was utterly intolerable. According to conflicting accounts, either the Precursors decided to wipe out the Forerunners entirely to make way for humanity, or the Forerunners simply struck preemptively to prevent being stripped of their power. Either way, what happened next was the largest military campaign the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Forerunners launched a genocidal war against their own creators, a rebellion of such shocking violence that the Precursors, who had never conceived that their own children would turn against them, were caught completely unprepared. Despite their vastly superior technology and near-omnipotent powers, the Precursors marveled at the sheer brutality and determination of the Forerunner assault rather than mounting an effective defense. Perhaps they couldn't bring themselves to destroy their own creations, or perhaps they simply couldn't comprehend the concept of such betrayal until it was far too late. The Forerunners pursued their creators across the Milky Way and even into Pathkathona, systematically exterminating almost every single precursor they could find. The few Forerunners who witnessed the full horror of what their species had done were forever changed by it. Those who traveled to Pathkathona never returned to the Milky Way, unable to bear the burden of their genocide. Others who defied their commanders or invoked the mantle in protest were either executed or exiled on barren worlds, left to die alone with the knowledge of their people's greatest crime. The Forerunners who survived the campaign carefully erased all records of what had happened, denying their war heroes any recognition, suppressing all evidence of the conflict, and constructing an elaborate mythology to hide the truth. For millions of years afterward, most Forerunners believed that the Precursors had peacefully passed away after bestowing the mantle upon them, never knowing that their entire civilization was built upon the greatest act of patricide in galactic history. But a handful of precursors survived the genocide, and they had very different ideas about how to spend their remaining time. Some went into suspended animation, sealing themselves in stasis capsules to wait out the ages. One such being would later be discovered by ancient humans and named the Primordial, a creature so twisted by eons of isolation and mutation that it barely resembled its original form. When interrogated by human scientists on the capital world of Charum Hakkor, the Primordial's answers about the flood were so horrifying that many of those present committed suicide rather than live with the knowledge. Other surviving precursors chose a different path. They used their mastery over their own biology to transform themselves into a fine, desiccated powder contained in glass cylinders aboard ancient spacecraft. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The powder would drift through space for millions of years, and when conditions were right, it would regenerate into living precursors who could reclaim the galaxy. But something went catastrophically wrong during those millions of years of waiting. The molecular structure of the powder degraded and became corrupted, twisted by the passage of time and perhaps by the precursors' own rage and grief at their betrayal. What should have been a means of resurrection became a vector for mutation, madness, and death. 10 million years after the Forerunner betrayal, around 107,000 years before the main Halo timeline, ancient humanity's interstellar empire made a discovery that would doom the galaxy. On multiple worlds near the edge of intergalactic space, they found crashed vessels of unknown origin. Inside these ships were millions of glass cylinders filled with a fine powder composed of short-chain organic molecules. Human scientists studied the substance extensively and declared it harmless. In fact, they noticed it had interesting psychotropic effects on lower animals, making them more docile and well-behaved. The primary test subjects were Feru, gentle herbivorous creatures that were popular pets among both humans and their allies, the Sanshyuum. For centuries, humans and Sanshyuum fed small doses of the powder to their Feru companions, delighted by how it improved their behavior. But beneath the surface, something insidious was happening. The powder, still retaining fragments of precursor consciousness and intelligence despite its corruption, was systematically altering the Feru's genetic code. It masked its true purpose behind behavioral improvements while quietly rewriting the very foundation of what these creatures were. Then, after generations of exposure, the mutations could no longer be hidden. The Feru began developing disturbing growths, furry protrusions between their shoulders and fleshy, striped rods emerging from their heads. Other Feru were compelled to consume these growths, despite being naturally herbivorous. The affected animals started suffering widespread abortions and genetic deformities, and desperate humans tried to euthanize the sick creatures or release them into the wild. But it was already far too late. The Feru that had been consumed as food, a common delicacy in human culture, became vectors for spreading the infection to their masters. Humans who had been in contact with the altered Feru began exhibiting the same symptoms, driven by the strange illness to consume infected tissue and spread the contagion to everything they touched. This was the birth of the flood, and it was more than just a parasitic organism. The corrupted precursor powder had transformed into a disease that reshaped its victims into specialized forms designed to gather more hosts, engage in combat, and rapidly consume biomass. The precursors who had survived in other forms, including the Primordial, recognized what had happened. Rather than mourn their failed resurrection or fight against this monstrous perversion of what they once were, they made a choice that would horrify even their enemies. They embraced it, driven to madness by the betrayal of their children and twisted by millions of years of corruption. The surviving precursors accepted the flood as their instrument of revenge. The ancient human empire fought desperately against the flood outbreak, sacrificing entire worlds and glassing planets to stop the infection's spread. In their desperation, they expanded into Forerunner territory, sometimes taking Forerunner worlds by force or destroying them completely if flood infection was detected. The Forerunners, who had no knowledge of the flood and believed their own mythology about peacefully inheriting the mantle, saw this as unprovoked aggression. They retaliated, and the Human-Forerunner War began, a tragic conflict born entirely from misunderstanding and the Precursors' calculated manipulation. During this war, the humans appeared to develop a cure for the flood, and the parasite mysteriously retreated from the galaxy. The Forerunners, victorious over humanity, devolved the human species as punishment, scattering them across primitive worlds and destroying all their research. They had no idea that there was no cure, that the flood had simply chosen to stop infecting humans because the precursors recognized in ancient humanity the worthiness they had seen millions of years before. The retreat was strategic, designed to make the Forerunners complacent and unprepared for what was coming. The precursors, through the flood, were playing the longest of games. When the flood returned around 97,000 years later, they came with a vengeance that would consume the galaxy. The Forerunners, who had destroyed all of humanity's research on the parasite, were completely unprepared. The flood grew exponentially, and as it consumed more biomass and integrated more minds, it achieved something terrifying. The collective intelligence of the flood compound mind reached transcendence, the same level of consciousness as the precursors themselves. This allowed the flood to access and control neural physics, awakening the dormant precursor technology that had lain scattered across the galaxy for millions of years. The star roads that had once connected precursor civilizations became weapons of unimaginable power in flood hands. These massive constructs could warp spacetime itself, crushing planets and tearing apart Forerunner fleets with ease. They disrupted slipspace travel, disabled Forerunner weapons and shields, and corralled entire armadas into kill zones where the flood could parasitize their crews. The Forerunners had no defense against technology that operated on principles they couldn't even fully understand, wielded by an enemy that was partly their own long-dead creators seeking revenge. For 300 years, the Forerunner Flood War raged across the galaxy, and slowly but surely the Forerunners lost. The Flood corrupted their AIs with something called the Logic Plague, turning their own technology against them. The Primordial, working through the Forerunner AI mendicant bias, orchestrated betrayals that shattered Forerunner defensive lines. System after system fell to the parasite, and the Forerunners were forced into an ever-shrinking sphere of territory. In the final years of the war, as the Forerunners made their last stand at the Greater Arc, the Precursors revealed one final act of vengeance through the corrupted memories of ancient human commanders absorbed by the flood. The domain, that vast repository of 100 billion years of precursor knowledge that the Forerunners had come to depend on as the foundation of their culture, was not Forerunner at all. It was Precursor built from neural physics, and when the Forerunners activated the Halo Array in a desperate attempt to starve the flood by wiping out all sentient life in the galaxy, they would destroy the domain as well. The Precursors had engineered the perfect revenge. The Forerunners would be forced to fire the halos to save the galaxy from the flood, but in doing so, they would kill their own soul, erasing their entire cultural heritage and all records of their civilization in one final, ironic act of self-destruction. When the halos fired in 97,445 BCE, they targeted all neural structures of sufficient complexity, which included the flood, but also every piece of precursor architecture in the galaxy. The star roads shattered, the domain went silent, and all evidence of the Precursors' physical existence was wiped away. The Forerunners survived on the Lesser Arc, then reseeded the galaxy with the species they had saved before retreating into exile, knowing they had failed in every possible way. The Precursors had succeeded in their revenge beyond even their own expectations. They had not merely destroyed the Forerunners physically, they had broken them spiritually, forcing them to abandon the mantle and ensuring they would never rise again. This is the story of the Precursors, the ancient architects whose betrayal and corruption set in motion every major conflict in the Halo universe. From the construction of the Halo rings to the Covenant's religious zealotry to the ongoing threat of the Flood, everything traces back to that moment 10 million years ago when the Forerunners turned against their creators. The Precursors began as godlike gardeners of the cosmos, carefully nurturing life and consciousness across the universe. They ended as the Flood, a twisted nightmare seeking vengeance through the total consumption of all existence. Their legacy is written across every star system in the Milky Way, in the ruins of Forerunner installations, in the domain that was eventually restored by surviving Forerunners, and in the continuing threat of the parasite they became. The Precursors remind us that, in the Halo universe, nothing is simple. The Flood isn't just a mindless parasite. It's the corrupted remains of beings who were once the shepherds of all life. The Forerunners weren't noble guardians who fell to an external threat. They were children who murdered their parents and spent millions of years living a lie. And humanity's role as inheritors of the mantle wasn't random chance. It was planned from the very beginning by beings who saw something in our species worth preserving, even as they themselves devolved into monsters. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the precursors and the cosmic horror underlying the Halo universe, make sure to leave a like on this video and drop a comment letting me know what you thought. Should I cover more about the Forerunners next? Or would you rather hear about ancient humanity's civilization before their defeat? Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when I upload new lore content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.